I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast, a podcast that's been called, quote, easily 10 times more useful than my MBA, which probably says more about higher education than our pod, but it was a nice review. We're going to start sending the pod along with some deeper content each week, so if you're a power listener of Idea to Startup, head to gettacklebox.beehive.com or the link in the show notes. Beehive is spelled a bit wildly, so it's gettacklebox.beehive.com. On to it. Today, we're going to report back on the Concierge MVP our doctor friend / podcast guinea pig ran over the past month. The goal was to teach other doctors a productivity system aimed at helping them feel less overwhelmed and hopefully a bit happier at work. It was awesome, and it was a disaster. We'll get into it. One note before we do. Last week, I ended the episode by asking you to email me with any Concierge MVP ideas that you had. Honestly, I just threw that request in there because I didn't think the Point Break joke was funny enough to end on. But I got a handful of emails from people describing their Concierge MVP ideas and asking me to poke holes in them, which was a blast. I also realized it'll probably be helpful to folks who have never run a Concierge MVP to see a bunch get run. So I'm going to work with a few of these founders and a few Tacklebox members to get some more Concierge MVP episodes up and out. Email team@gettacklebox.com if you're working on an idea and considering a Concierge MVP or trying to figure out what one might look like. I'll do a few of these live, and I'll even pick one person who emails at random to get 6 months of our new self-paced Tacklebox program free. A cool $745 value. Okay, enough of that. I'm sure you're dying to hear what part of the Concierge MVP was a disaster, and frankly, I'm dying to tell you about it. On last week's episode, the third in the series, we helped our doctor friend zoom in on a Concierge MVP, a white glove, no-tech way to test out his hypothesis with his initial customer. If you didn't listen to the first few episodes in the series, feel free to go back and check them out. But as always, this episode is going to stand on its own. Maybe you don't have time to listen to the last few episodes because you, like my wife and I, have been glued to The Perfect Couple on Netflix. I'm not going to judge you, but Greer probably would. She's hiding something, right? Anyway, a brief recap on how we got to this point. A doctor reached out to us because he was frustrated. He increasingly spent more time answering emails and questions in the doctor portal than, in his words, actually doctoring. There is also a nursing shortage. Depression amongst doctors is rising, and there's been an exodus to concierge MD models as private equity shops have rolled up hospitals like rugs and increased patient loads on doctors. It's a mess, or more kindly, a changing landscape. Our doctor initially wanted to help these doctors find jobs at startups or join concierge MD programs, but after a bunch of customer tests, he realized this wasn't actually a problem. The real problem, the one doctors were actively trying to solve, was productivity. In the words of a doctor he interviewed, quote, "I learned an insane amount in med school about diseases and medicines and procedures, but I learned nothing, absolutely nothing, about how to balance my day between inbound requests and patients and research. So I'm trying to learn that on my own, and it has been tough." Through customer interviews, we found doctors doing things like reading Atomic Habits and watching productivity videos on YouTube. Our doctor, coincidentally a lover of the intersection of productivity and doctoring, had a hypothesis that teaching productivity could free up 5 to 10 hours a week minimum for his doctor colleagues. And maybe more importantly, it'd make them feel like they weren't constantly missing things and behind the 8 ball. They'd be clear-minded and thoughtful with patients again. So we mapped out a Concierge MVP, a test of this hypothesis before we built a product to solve for it. Our founder emailed a bunch of the doctors he'd interviewed, as well as other doctors in his network, and pitched a 3-day seminar over 3 weeks, 1 day a week, that helped them learn productivity basics. The goal of the seminar was to start building your productivity system. The doctors would begin with a full audit to understand how they were spending every minute of their day. Next, they'd implement a new system and run it for a week to find the cracks. Finally, they'd recalibrate based on how the week went and build a plan moving forward. The cost our founder grudgingly agreed to charge, he wanted to do it for free, was $1,000, and the program started a few weeks after he sent that initial sales email. The product, the seminar, was not built. What could go wrong? Time to see. And we'll start with an email I got from the founder at 1:24 a.m. just a couple of days after he sent that initial sales email. The subject of the email said, quote, "What do I need and what do I not need?" I couldn't have written a better segment title myself. So let's go with it. Part 1. What do you need and what do you not need? Our founder had sent out that initial sales email and hadn't yet heard back from anyone. But while he waited, he decided to build out the presentations, or the quote, product. When he sat down to map it all out, he said that the whole thing started to feel real and a million questions popped into his head, which led to the email at 1:24 in the morning. Here it is. Quote, "Hey, so I'm starting to build the actual product part of this, and I realized I don't have a lot of things. I don't have a company name. I don't have an email. I put a price in the sales email and said to respond if interested, but I don't have a way to take money if anyone wants to pay. I don't have a company profile on LinkedIn. I'm not listed as the founder of this company on LinkedIn. I'm not incorporated. I don't have a way to pay its sales tax. And most importantly, I don't even know how to make a good product. How do I make sure these sessions deliver what I'm promising? I feel like this whole thing isn't buttoned up enough. I think we should postpone or cancel." This is a common email in my line of work, and if you start working on a Concierge MVP, you're going to have this moment too, and probably write this email to someone. When it inevitably happens, my biggest piece of advice is to think of Scooby Doo. Because what happens in like 80% of Scooby Doo episodes, if I remember correctly, is that the monster or ghost or whoever the bad guy is ends up just being like three kids standing on each other's shoulders with a costume on. And that is what's happening with all these questions. When all these things that you haven't done before are stacked on each other's shoulders, they look really scary. But breaking them down reveals small, solvable problems that far dumber people than you have navigated for years. Don't be fooled by the kids on each other's shoulders with a sheet over their head. So, I helped our founder go down the list. First, do you need a name? Sure, but you'll likely change the name at some point, so this first name isn't worth stopping momentum. It's not that big of a deal. Our doctor friend asked if I'd thought of a name, and of course I had. Doctor's orders. He grabbed it and ran with it. Next, do you need a company email? Definitely not for warm connections. For cold connections, it might build some trust, so you can buy a domain at Namecheap for $10 in 5 minutes and then set up a Google account so you can have doctor@doctorsordersproductivity.com or whatever you decide to buy for a few bucks a month. That will also take you about 5 minutes. But your personal email address is probably fine for now. I ran Tacklebox for a year from my personal Gmail. Next, how will people pay? PayPal is fine for now, or Venmo. There is no need for Stripe. You'll have built enough trust through interviews or existing relationships that customers won't bat an eye at a PayPal request. You can formalize all of this later. Next, how will you pay tax, and do you need to be incorporated? Again, you can do all of this at the end of the year, if and when you've accepted the amount of money that meets the threshold for taxing. It's simple to set up and relatively inexpensive through something like Stripe Atlas, and it's retroactive to the beginning of the year. It's not an immediate blocker. Just track transactions and move on. In general, the answer to basically all of the, quote, "do I need to do X to my business to make it look buttoned up and professional before my Concierge MVP questions is no. Your first customers aren't going to be cold. You'll likely have an existing relationship with them or have, at the very least, interviewed them a few times. These are going to be hand-picked people. They'll know this is new and they'll expect it to operate that way. Never let polish slow you down. Polish is not important now. The important thing is the value you create, which was our founder's last question. The fun one. How the heck do I build a product when I've never built a product before? That one's got a longer answer, and we'll get to it after a few words from our good friends at Byldd. This episode of Idea to Start a Podcast is brought to you by our good friends at Byldd. That's BYLDD.com. They're a development agency that helps early stage startups build and launch scalable, revenue generating software businesses. Development from non-technical founders and teams without a tech person on them is the massive elephant in the room that just sits there judging you while you run all of your customer work and intent tests. And once you've validated your idea and you know that customers want what you've decided to build, you've got to figure out how to build it. That's where things get sticky. You probably don't have $100K to throw at a huge creative agency, and even if you did, for your first product, you probably shouldn't. You might roll the dice on Upwork and it might work, but you'll need to project manage the whole thing. The cost will be a black box, and I cannot stress enough the might in that first sentence. For $10K and roughly a month of work, Byldd will get your validated product up and out. Head to Byldd.com to talk to Ayush, that's BYLDD.com, and tell him you heard about it through Idea to Startup. Back to it. Part 2. Your product should be tailored, not new. When you run a Concierge MVP, you'll eventually need to build something. It's rarely a technical product. Instead, you're building a flow, a structured journey that guides your customer through solving their problem with your help. The key is to avoid creating this flow from scratch. We'll lean on proven systems whenever possible. But before all of that, we need to think about the test itself in jobs to be done terms. What are we hiring this Concierge MVP to do for us? The answer is insight. We need to get close to our customer and watch them struggle with the problem. It's about understanding their behavior, tools, and pain points so that we can eventually build a product that is a direct reaction to those behaviors, tools, and pain points. So for the Concierge MVP, we are hiring it to get feedback and visibility into that struggle. That is where our doctor's initial idea about the 3 days of workshops spread over 3 weeks came from. He'd engage with doctors, give them some tasks, then pull them back in to see how it all went, to hear about the struggle. But it still leaves us with a bunch of work. What the heck do we build? That is where the idea of a tailored, not new, product comes in. You need to take an existing, effective solution and tailor it to your specific audience. You don't rebuild the wheel, you customize it for a specific road. Our doctor had a ton of experience with David Allen's Getting Things Done methodology, and he'd adapted it to a doctor's reality for himself in the past, so that's what he decided to do for the Concierge MVP. He'd act as a guide, tailoring a tried and true method to a new space. This approach helps you build what I call a 2% product, where 98% is something that already works, but you tweak that final 2% to make it 10 times more effective for your audience. The 2% is the differentiator, it's the thing that matters, and it is what you focus on. This is by far my favorite type of product. When you take a practice or tool or method that's table stakes, that's part of the electricity of one industry, and apply it to an industry that, for whatever reason, hasn't encountered it yet. And regardless of what you're building and for who, we've always been able to find a product or idea or theory we can piggyback off for a Concierge MVP. Great. Now that he's got a guide, how does he practically build the product and what does it look like? Part 3. Customer journey and tell the story. The best way to build a product when you haven't built a product before, especially a Concierge MVP that'll be so much about process, is to get 2 giant pieces of paper and put them on the ground. On the first piece of paper, you're going to write a story in long form during a minimum 30-minute block of time. This story is the story of your wildly successful Concierge MVP. It takes place for our doctor in 3 weeks after the MVP is complete. The story just tells what happened, why it was so successful, how people reacted, what it sets you up to do next. This is best case scenario, and you're completely making it up. Telling the story of wild success is one of my favorite practices. I cannot recommend it enough. After an awkward 5 or 10 minutes where you don't know what to write, a story will start to spill out of you. You'll fill the paper with 1,000 words that'll describe exactly what you need to build. If you don't believe me, just try it. The second piece of paper, then, is where you make it all real. You build what we call a customer journey. All the touch points you're going to have with your customer and the motion you're trying to create during this Concierge MVP. This starts with a line you draw that breaks the page in 2. On that line are all the moments you'll interact with your customer. So for our doctor friend, this starts with a sales email. That's a dot on the line. The next dot might be a second sales email, a couple of days later, perhaps with a discount. Then a final email reminder might be a few days after that. Next, for people who buy and join the product, an email with payment details and a schedule. Then an invite for the dates, and on and on. Beneath each touchpoint, you want to put an emoji or a few words that describe the emotion you want your customer to feel while they engage with that touchpoint. You might be trying to build trust or focus on logistics. This single emotion will keep your interaction tight. The customer journey should be as simple as you can make it, and I'd constantly check it against ChatGPT or whatever AI you like to use to ask if it meets the standard for quality user experience. Copy in your customer journey, then ask the AI what emails they would add or remove, where a customer might get confused, and so on. AI is fantastic for this sort of thing. For the workshops, our doctor used a few guides. First, the David Allen Getting Things Done framework, as we mentioned, specifically a workbook Allen sells. He'll have everyone buy a copy for his workshop, too. Second, he used a framework delivered in Rob Fitzpatrick's book, How to Design and Teach Workshops That Work Every Time. This led to a first session that had three main parts. First, a time audit, a tracking framework, a simple Google sheet that encouraged participants to track every minute of their workday for a week, categorizing activities and noting interruptions. Second was task inventory. Doctors listed all their regular tasks, from patient consultations to administrative work, and rated them on importance and urgency. And finally, there was pain point identification. Through a guided discussion, participants pinpointed their biggest productivity struggles. This was delivered through a keynote presentation that had around 30 slides with an overview of GTD and specific examples of how he'd implemented the GTD framework for himself. The homework for participants was the daily audit, so he had emails each morning as a reminder to track that. At lunch, there was another prompt to make sure they were caught up. Once the content for the workshop was finished, our founder sent me another note. Finished the workshop, it said, but still no buyers. Uh-oh. On to part 4. Part 4. How many customers are necessary and should you discount? Our founder had priced his product at $1,000, and while he was pretty sure he'd be able to help people get it reimbursed by their company, a week before the first workshop, he had no bites. So, what should he do? Should he postpone it? Should he quit altogether? My first suggestion was to email the champion directly, the person who was so excited about this but hadn't yet bought. We wanted to learn the risk. What was the thing that stuck out that was keeping them from buying? Was it price, timing, structure? Our founder emailed and within minutes had a response that said, quote, "I'm so sorry, I just forgot to buy. I just did it though. See you next week." A moment later, PayPal dinged with a $1,000 purchase. Our friend had a business. As David Foster Wallace said, you'll stop worrying what people think about you when you realize how seldom they do. We, as founders, are sitting around waiting for a customer to buy the thing we sent to them, or open the email, or respond to it, or give us any indication that they care. They, as the customer, are worried about their kid's soccer practice, or the Italian restaurant in their town shutting down, or getting their dog to the vet. They don't think of us, and that's fine. You'll need to push people, even the excited ones. As for the other customers, our doctor had a question. "I can't run with this with like one person, can I?" he asked. I had an old boss who used to talk about the hidden superpower for all the best entrepreneurs that he'd met: optimism. I remember one scenario where a founder we'd invested in had released a new product and gotten like 5 customers. He told us about it like it was the greatest thing in the world, but more, he talked about it like 5 customers had been the goal the whole time. He talked about how great it was that he had these 5 customers, what he could learn from them because there were so few and it'd be so intimate, how this was going to get him to the next step. At the end of the meeting, I was talking to my boss about how smart it was that he'd limited the release to 5 customers, and my boss laughed. Well, he tried to get 100, but someone like him doesn't get bad news. Everything to him is usable. So he got 5 customers, and now he'll mold that into something that can have serious impact. That is an entrepreneur's job, to take 1 plus 1 and make it 3. You've got to be endlessly optimistic to do that. So I talked about the optimism approach for our doctor. 1 customer, if that's all we got, was plenty. I asked him a version of the question my boss used to ask. Why is 1 customer better than a bunch? What can you do with just 1 customer that you couldn't have done with 10 that'll move the business forward faster? Our founder thought for a minute and then started rattling things off. If there was only 1 customer, he could do a midweek check-in with them. He could research the specific tech stack at the customer's hospital and tailor each week's content to it. It was way more likely he'd be able to make 1 customer wildly successful than 10, especially this early. But he said 3 or 4 might be good too if I'm going to do all this work, so should I send out a coupon code? The approach I like here is to offer discounts to see if price is the blocker, but to make sure you get some other type of value for that discount. Maybe offering 50% off for the workshop in exchange for an hour-long feedback session after the process is over, and a testimonial in white paper form if all goes well. Our doctor liked this idea and emailed the group with the offer. A few days later, his PayPal pinged again. He got a second participant. There would be 2 customers for the Concierge MVP. Part 5, How It Went. And now we reach our disaster. For the first session, with his 2 paying customers, our doctor's internet went out. He couldn't get on Zoom on his computer, so he ended up having to use his phone. But he couldn't share slides from there, and he couldn't record the session. So he hastily emailed the slides to his customers and talked through them as best as he could. It went, in his words, horribly. So after the session, he recorded a series of 5-minute Loom videos hitting on the key points he was hoping to make. He also recorded a 5-minute Loom on the daily tasks, how the doctors were supposed to track their time. As he explained the tracking, he realized it didn't make sense and he made a brand new Excel time tracking sheet on the fly. He told them to disregard the other one he sent and sent that one, again, along with a Loom video. He also realized that during the session, his customers weren't anywhere near as familiar with general productivity terms as he'd assumed, so he started making a library for them, productivity terms and how they applied to doctors. This series of short Loom follow-up videos ended up being a massive, massive hit with his customers. Optimism, baby. The doctors tracked every action they took for a full week. They were blown away with what they found. For the second workshop, our doctor focused the presentation on setting up the GTD systems with the hospital setting in mind. He used the David Allen 5 pillars and customized them for doctors: capture, clarify, organize, reflect, and engage. Over the next week, both customers were emailing him questions constantly, so he opened up a Slack channel for them to all use. He continued making short, clarifying Loom videos and posting them there. The final workshop started as content he delivered, but evolved into a massive sharing session. What had worked for what doctor and what hadn't. They shared tactics they'd tried, wins and losses, and generally had a blast talking through the challenges. The call went on for 3 hours as our founder took frantic notes. The final step was formal feedback. On a call with each, he asked questions about whether the course was worth the money, whether they felt they'd implement the system permanently, and what else they needed to do that. He asked how they'd describe it to other doctors, and finally gave each a 50% discount code they could pass on to colleagues. One customer said the workshop had been, quote, game-changing. The other said it was, quote, life-altering. Both said the content was rough around the edges and that the product had been a bit unpolished, but each said that the reflection journal alone, tracking how they spent each day, was well worth the total cost. As for how they describe it to other doctors, one said, quote, you know you need a better system for the admin stuff. This is the accountability you need to make that system. It's actually all common sense, but this forces you to actually do it. The second doctor said, quote, you'll do the audit and you'll be shocked by how much time you're wasting. Then you'll build a system to not waste that time anymore. It's easy to put this stuff off, but the program forces you to do it. The audit and the accountability stood out. Within a few days, our doctor friend got 3 more emails from new doctors who wanted to pay him $1,000 to get their productivity lessons. Doctors' orders was growing. Part 6, the end and what's next. The Concierge MVP our doctor built isn't a product. I mean, it could be. He could scale these sessions. But the important part of a Concierge MVP is the step after the Concierge MVP. And that step isn't to just try and scale whatever it is you built. It's to study the actions of your customer, to think about the pockets of extreme disproportionate value you created, to understand the stuff that got your customer excited, the moments that mattered and created growth, to see where you can zoom in. The job to be done of your customer will be revealed by their actions. Then you build for that. I love Concierge MVPs because they get you going. In a lot of ways, it's day 1 of your startup, and the faster you get to that, the faster you get to day 2. For our doctor, he was blown away with the response to the audit. He thinks that alone can be a product, a tracker of how doctors act to make it clear and obvious to them how haphazard their time management is and how they can change it. He's working on that. And for you, hopefully this is inspirational. This guy who'd never built a business before has now made around $5,000 teaching doctors how to manage their time. It seems like there's a lot more there, and we only found it through this process. Just like how the police officers on The Perfect Couple only found the murderer through a process. I'm not sure if that makes any sense or connects, but while writing this episode, I finished the show, and I'll tell you what, I did not see that ending coming. Greer, man. What a trip. This was the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job, head to gettacklebox.com and check out our programs. I bet there's one that can help. Have a great week.